Okay, I know some of y'all have slept since last week. I'm Warren. I'm the preacher. They let me preach here. I'm in Acts 18. I'm hoping that's where everybody, Acts 18. Unfortunately, I've got a few of those myself. Russ, how about leading us in prayer, please?
We can learn more about your word, what happened, the church was set up, and what it means to us. We ask that you bless the fellowship here. Be with our elders, and wives, and ministers. Be with the members. We can feel your spirit here when we gather together. This is your son's name we pray.
Okay, Acts 18. Paul's still in his third missionary journey. Reach a church that I consider
Very familiar. Basically because you find it so often in the New Testament. Look in Acts 18, verse 1. The last time I was here, a couple of weeks ago, we left Paul. He had finished up in Athens. The response evidently was not particularly sizable, unlike a lot of the cities where he went. It doesn't mean there wasn't a church established in Athens, but the way Luke records it, it did not have the same numbers of so many of the other places where he went. So he leaves from Corinth, back with my air map. No, I'm going to go get the real map. I took a vote a week ago about which you preferred, the air map or the real map, and it was inconclusive, so I'm just going to bring it back in here. Well, that won't help me anyway. It's not the right page. There we are. Okay. So, this gives you an idea where we are with Paul. We've got Jerusalem way over here. We've got Ephesus right here. That's where we'll be in Acts 19. But he's been through the trip through Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, down to Athens, and finally Corinth is one of those cities we know a lot about, not just historically, but scripturally. It just has a very familiar ring to it because we get so much input on or about the church in Corinth. Somebody describe for me. Give me a one adjective to describe the church in Corinth right after Paul establishes it. Think about what we know about the church. On fire. Why do you say on fire?
Okay. I can see that.
Bit of tribalism.
Why do you say tribalism?
I'm after Apollos, I'm after Paul.
Yes. By the time he writes 1 Corinthians, the church has only
been
been
in existence about 4 years. And so it's a very young church. And even though they did start off, it seems, with considerable zeal, it didn't take long for these. Have you ever planted, put out fresh topsoil and plant it with let's say, Bermuda seed and everything looks great? What does it not take any time at all to happen? Weeds start popping up. And if I were going to describe Corinth as a yard, that's the way I would describe her. She started off strong. She's established by Paul. He spends as much time here, other than the church at Ephesus, he spends as much time here or more than just about any other place he stops. So you know that they've been taught well. You can imagine how much you would learn studying at the feet of Paul for at least 18 months, because Luke leaves it open on how much longer than that, but at least a year and a half. Paul spends with the church there in Corinth, and it is dedicated, concentrated instruction, edification. They're going to have a much better foundation when it comes to doctrine and understanding the truth of the Lord than, say, Thessalonica, where he only gets to spend weeks there, maybe a month or two there. They didn't get exposed to Paul for an extended period of time, and Corinth does. Now, Tommy, you had a comment. What did you say a minute ago?
I find it a miracle that Corinth, the church existed in that city of Corinth.
Good. Why do you say that?
Because of the culture that's there.
Okay?
It's as crooked and devious as Dallas, Texas is.
Ooh, boy,
That's an interesting comparison. I did not see that one coming. Okay, as crooked as Dallas, Texas. Wow.
Commercial super of the Roman Empire,
it is.
just as Dallas is here.
Okay? But it's
You've
also,
got the same kind of cultural mix coming and going from all over the world, just like Dallas is.
yes.
And because of their strategic location, you also have a pretty rough element to the society because they were located on that narrow isthmus. Try saying that 3 times fast. If you could see the map, again, I'll expand it out with my air map. You can either sail all the way down around the lower tip below Sparta and come back up here, or you can bring your ship to right here. They could carry it across this narrow strip of land. I forget, it's only, I think, 20 miles wide right here. They could put it across, and you can save traveling down and around. And so it made for a much shorter trip to Rome. And so Corinth had a lot of benefits from her location, from her geographical setup. She was the center. She had a major temple for Apollos, and then she was a center of the worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of fertility, which was all about sexual immorality and sensuality and that type of thing, to the point that I don't know, Tommy, that I've ever heard anybody use the word Dallasite to describe somebody who is a sexual degenerate, but you did with Corinth. If you talked about to Corinthianize, you were talking about somebody that there were literally no holds barred when it comes to. Well, I don't go there because of traffic, but okay. I can see that. Dennis?
Paul should out said had a relation with his stepmother.
Yes, and that was in that.
Letter as well, wasn't it? Matter of fact, he told the church to cast him out. That was a pretty serious event. So again, you've got these weeds showing up. You've got tribalism. You've got sexual immorality in the case of the son going into his father's wife. You had members taking one another to court. You had them flirting with the pagan festivals for the idols. You go through 1 Corinthians, and you had the Christian men, it seems, going into prostitutes, and you had Christian husbands and wives abstaining and no longer having the relations they were supposed to have. And Paul's got to address all of that. And so when you read 1 Corinthians, that letter, it helps then to go back and to get a feel for where this church is going to head. Now, as soon as I say that, we know more about their dirty laundry really than we do any other congregation. Does Paul, let me word this, does Paul view them as of lesser importance or lesser value because of their dirty laundry? No, he'll talk to them and refer to them as brothers, as saints, as part of the temple of the Holy Spirit. Just list descriptive term after descriptive term, and the fact that he writes 2 letters to the church, as well as sending his personal emissaries to go and work and continue to support and encourage the church at Corinth. All of these things are in the mix. So when we read Acts 18, in my way of thinking, this is a fairly compact account of Paul's work with the church that apparently was very significant. And when you talked about it, it was surprising that a church would exist there. To exist there, not just to be established, but to thrive there in the midst of that kind of culture, had to be just a real testament to their zeal, to their heart, their faith. They were one of the first to commit to sending support back for the needy back in Judea. There's a lot of positives about Corinth that we tend to overlook. So let's. Okay.
Because of the culture that the church grew up in. You need not to be too harsh or jump to too severe a judgment on them, because, like I said, it's a miracle age existing.
It was miracle age and existed. Let me toss another question out there.
Do you think that Paul could have written similar letters to other congregations in the first century as well? Just because we've got these two letters recorded and the Spirit saves them as part of the Scriptures, doesn't mean that Paul didn't have to write letters to other congregations dealing with much of the same dirty laundry that they had, that Corinth had. Because in the Roman world, especially when you got out of Judea, they were immersed in these very immoral standards, whether it was idolatry, whether it was sexual immorality, greed, other things like that. And so he could have very well had to write letters to some of the other congregations very similar to Corinth, and the Spirit did not see fit to preserve them as part of Scripture. So it may well be that the letters to the Corinthians, he might have written some very similar to some of the other churches that just weren't preserved.
Ooh, I like that statement. What do you mean by it? So
You take the world as a whole, you can condense it down, you get carnal.
yeah, he pretty well addresses most every.
Possible.
Yes. Even to the point of having the best of
Intentions and not necessarily the best follow through when he has to deal with the contribution in 2 Corinthians. So, yeah, that's good. I like that. Dennis?
Number 4, that's some major problems.
Ephesus had some major problems.
As a matter of fact, she was in danger of losing her existence, according to Revelation 2. Mostly because she left her first love. But, yeah, Ephesus had some problems too. Again, we don't get a detailed issue-by-issue letter to Ephesus recorded in Scripture. The Scriptures are preserved not so much for Corinth's benefit as they're preserved for our benefit. And so, the Spirit didn't necessarily have to preserve multiple letters dealing with this same laundry list, because they've already addressed them in those two letters. And maybe that's part of what's going on here. Okay, let's start reading in verse 1 of chapter 18. It says, after these things, after the situation at Athens, he said, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. He found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And as I understand it, archaeology dates that pretty accurately. I think it's in AD 49 when that happened, in part because of increasing friction and conflict among the Jewish community in Rome. And Caesar said, okay, that's it. Y'all are out of here. And so they had to leave for a time. They were allowed to come back. And according to It's not Josephus. It's that Roman historian, who makes reference to followers of Christos, or something along those lines, which leads many scholars to believe the conflict going on in the Jewish community in Rome had to do with conflict between Jews and the young Christian church that had been established in Rome. And maybe that was part of what was going on there. Okay. Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. Because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. Literally, the word means more leather workers. Tent was your very common use of leather in those days, but Paul came from Cilicia, which was well known, famous for clothing that was made from goat's hair. And so all of that probably falls under the same heading. But King James uses tent makers, and that's fine. It says, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Now, here's one of those questions. I started to let you read this section and just toss your questions out, but I decided I wouldn't. We'll work through it. Here's one of my questions. Until Silas and Timothy rejoined Paul, and we talked a couple of weeks ago, Paul leaves Thessalonica, Berea, Philippi. As far as we can tell, he's left Luke in Philippi. Thessalonica, he leaves Timothy. Berea, he leaves Silas. Tells them to join him at all speed. And based on other passages, not what's found in Acts, but based on references in some of the other letters, it's apparent that Timothy and Silas do come down, join Paul in Athens for a short time. He sends them back. He said, I considered it better to be left alone in Athens. Sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. And so it appears that Timothy and Silas joined Paul just for a moment in Athens. He sends him back to continue to address situations. He goes to Corinth, and then finally they return and rejoin him long term. But here's my question. He spends however many weeks before Silas and Timothy get there interacting with the Jews in the synagogue about what? Why do you say about Christ? Compare verse 4 and verse 5. That's one of my question marks. Barbara, what do you think that the distinction? Okay. See, that's when I read verses 4 and 5, and Luke is a very careful historian as far as we can tell. When I read verses 4 and 5, I tend to read it more like that. And yet, I've never known Paul not to come in and go right to the meat of the matter, so to speak, right?
Confirms what she's arguing.
Okay.
How do you reason with somebody if they don't know it to begin with?
Okay. I like the idea of
laying groundwork. But if that's the case, this is the only instance I know of where Paul approaches it this way. Every other situation, he comes in and he's all about Jesus and the resurrection, the passion, the death, burial, and resurrection. He tells the Corinthians in second chapter of the first letter, he says, I determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. So if he's spending several weeks laying the groundwork, which makes good sense, it's just, for me, very surprising. And yet the way Luke records it, it seems to imply that very thing. He decided not to lower the boom and start out with Jesus as the Christ, but instead he lays groundwork. When Silas and Timothy get there, he can't wait any longer, and bang, he goes right for the right for the bullseye. And based on their response, okay, it sounds like it was the right target. So it says, verse 5, he testified to the Jews, Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, and here's another reason why I wonder about that. It's not until verse 6 that it says the Jews opposed him and blasphemed. In verse 4, it says he persuaded both Jews and Greeks. That seems to indicate that he was, to use your language, laying the groundwork, building that bridge of connection so that when the time was right and it was time to go ahead and make the blunt truth of the gospel known, he had laid the groundwork. He had done everything in his power to provide them a ready hearing of the gospel itself. It's just surprising to me. It says, when they opposed him and blasphemed, verse 6, he shook his garments, said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. He departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Now, does that mean only the Gentiles went with him? No. Verse 8, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, you can bet this man is a well-established, well-respected Jew to be the ruler of the synagogue at this point. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. Many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. And again, Tommy, you pointed out it's miraculous that the church exists here. Yes, it is. And they're responding so readily. Whereas the Athenians, by and large, were not all that eager to respond to the gospel. There were some in Athens who did, but not in droves, as is indicated here. Verse 9, the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak. Do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. That's got to be refreshing, because he'd been through Philippi and being beaten with rods and locked in prison, and Thessalonica, where the Jews stirred up, and Berea, where they stirred up there as well. I could see that being very encouraging. He says, no one will attack you to hurt you. Now, here's an interesting statement. For I have many people in this city. What's he saying by that one? Huh?
He has several Christian people.
Yeah, but at this point, he's not talking about the ones that have already
Already been established, already been converted. The harvest is ready, and he already knows. Anytime you get into a discussion/debate with someone who truly believes in predestination, they'll use a passage like this one to say, see, God's already determined who's going to be saved and who isn't. I don't see that as being what he says here. Look back in John chapter 10. Jesus made another statement there that sometimes we overlook. We understand it better now than they did surely when they first heard it. But John chapter 10, let's see. He starts in verse 11. He says, I am the what? John chapter 10, verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. And he goes on. He's moved from being the door or the gate to the pasture, and he's changed that imagery into the good shepherd. And I'm sure he's drawing on Psalm 23 and other passages like it. Ezekiel talks about shepherds. But he goes on and he talks about his flock. Look at verse 14. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. What does he say in verse 16? Okay, other sheep I have that are not of this fold. All the way through, of course, his earthly ministry, Jesus works almost exclusively with what body of people? The Jewish people. Now, very shortly, he's going to commission his apostles and his followers to go into all the world and make disciples. I see Jesus saying the same thing here. He says, there's more to the flock than what you see. It's not just Jews. It's not just the ones that have already been converted. I already know that there are other sheep to be added in, to be brought or returned to the flock, so to speak. Yes, he had made that clear, even though most missed it at first. Yeah, but they still had issues. Yeah, that was a pretty big one. The centurion servant is another one that's pretty big. Um, so yes, he had shown it, but again, they still had. Is it Luke chapter 7 or 9, where John and James want to call down fire from heaven to destroy a city of Samaria because they wouldn't receive him? Okay, that surely happened after the woman at the well. I think they're still wrestling with it all the way through his ministry. It gets better later. Anyway, I see that as part of this statement. I have many people in this city. The Lord already knows. It's no problem with foreknowledge, because we believe in a God who transcends time. He knows past, present, future without question or issue. Foreknowledge is different than predestination. Back in Acts 18, verse 11. He continues there for a year and 6 months. We know he's there at least 18 months. But if you drop down to verse 18, you find out he still remained many days. So how long that implies, we can't necessarily limit it, but we know he's there at least a year and a half. Okay, verse 12. The events with Gallio, this is important for the church in several ways, but especially this is a Roman official in a position of considerable authority, and he's going to set a precedent here when it comes to the legality or illegality of Christianity. Well, if we do, Gallio's not a particularly positive role model. But, okay.
I never saw that light. Now I'm going to be looking at that.
That going, Let's read the account, verse 12. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord, now that's not the believing Jews, the ones who withdrew with Paul, but the rest, the unbelieving Jews. The Jews with one accord rose up against Paul, brought him to the bema, the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And I love the way this is done. Paul was ready to defend himself. Verse 14, when Paul was about to open his mouth, it's almost like Gallio saw his mouth opening and said, hang on a minute. He said to the Jews, he turns to the accusers, and he says, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. Now they've accused him contrary to the law. Obviously, he understands they're talking about the Jewish law. He says, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names in your own law, look to it yourselves. I do not want to be a judge of such matters. It's one of those instances where Gallio he basically sets a precedent against condemning Christianity as an illegal religion. It's not a empire-wide decision, to be sure, but this is one of those instances where if Luke is writing a defense for one of Paul's trials, he could go, you remember Gallio? He looked at this and said, there wasn't any merit to this. What is it they said? The crime has no standing? Is that it? Or the crime has no merit? Well, I couldn't remember if it's a crime that has no standing or the accusers, the complainants. Okay, so we would say Gallio's statement here basically is that the case has no merit. Not necessarily that the Jews didn't have a right to argue it, but he says, I'm not going to put up with you at all. Now, verse 17 throws a little curveball. Let's get this through 16 first. He says, I do not want to be a judge of such matters, and he drove them from the judgment seat. Then, and here you can tell if you're following King James or New King James, or whether you're looking at some of the other more modern translations. The New King James follows the Old King James. It says, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes. The text actually says, then they took Sosthenes. And you have to figure out who the they are, because the Greek really doesn't identify it, to the point that the most likely grammatical reference of they is the same group in verse 16 that's called them. And who is the them in verse 16? The Jewish accusers. If that's the right antecedent, then they, the Jewish accusers, took Sosthenes, who either replaced Crispus as the ruler of the synagogue, or they were co-rulers of the synagogue. I assume that was possible. I haven't seen it anywhere else. It would be the accusing Jews, took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio ignored it. He took no notice of such things. That's why many think that the words all the Greeks were supplied, because they couldn't reconcile the Jews beating Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. Here's another possibility. Flip over to 1 Corinthians 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes. Now, I've seen scholars that say, well, surely this wasn't the same Sosthenes. I'm going, why would you say that? Within 4 years, Paul's going to write back, and he's going to write back and reference someone that they know well, one of our brother Sosthenes, who's got the same name as the one beaten right here. I think they really have to stretch to argue against that. In my mind, Sosthenes is also either he has been friendly to Paul and this new sect, or he maybe has already been converted. Not sure which, but I just can't see saying outright, that can't be the same guy. Steve?
In verse 8, it talks about Crispus, the synagogue ruler.
Right.
Now, these are in the same town, right?
They could be a separate synagogue, you're right.
Could Crispus and Sosthenes be the same person? Peter and Cephas? Because if so, then this would make a little bit more sense, because Crispus was friendly toward Paul.
Yeah, he's converted.
Yeah, and the Jews are mad because they're not going to be heard in court, and they take out their anger on the synagogue ruler. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that, in my mind it does.
I don't remember anyone ever suggesting that. Let me toss out a few more ideas in just a second. David?
Crispus, a Latin name, a Roman name, and Sosthenes is clearly a Greek name.
It seems odd, but many of the Romans did have three names. That's one possibility. Here's the theories to explain this. One, Sosthenes is beaten by the Greeks as representative of the accusing party. That is one possibility, although it doesn't make sense with 1 Corinthians 1:1, but maybe. Another possibility is that there's more than one synagogue in the city. Crispus was the ruler of one, Sosthenes the ruler of another. I don't remember anyone suggesting the same name. Keep in mind, between Crispus and Sosthenes being introduced in the story, you've got a 2-year lapse. So Crispus was evidently a former ruler of the synagogue when he follows Paul. That seems to be implied by the text. And so Sosthenes could have been his replacement. He could have been a co-ruler. He could have been ruler of a sister synagogue in the same region, although I don't know any example of that. Never heard. I'm gonna see if I can find anybody else who came up with that suggestion. That one interests me. I'm curious about that.
The scriptures in other places. That, to me, that comes into question. Why would he say our brother?
Oh, I know Sosthenes is a
Christian in 1 Corinthians 1:1.
The scripture itself,
Okay.
I'm saying this is way at the other end.
I agree. Now, here's the problem I have with
Sosthenes already being a Christian, though. When Crispus is described as the, present tense, ruler of the synagogue who believes, well, you've got the Jewish hostility, you've got the Jews acting as a unit, taking Paul and accusing him. I just cannot believe that Crispus was not deposed or removed from his position as ruler of the synagogue. 2 years later, Sosthenes, again, present tense, is spoken of as the current ruler of the synagogue. If he's already a Christian, I can't help but believe he would have been removed as well, considering the hostility and the lengths that the Jews as a whole are willing to do against Paul. So that's one of the issues I've got with them being the same person, I guess.
Be likely, since one, he was beaten by the Greeks when the judge kicked him out, that he was one of the complainants. That he was head of the synagogue and this rabid mob of Jews. He quite possibly could have been the spokesperson for the mob of Jews, for the judgment seat, which is why he was the target after the judge said, "Get out of here."
Yes, and that's been the traditional view. The only problem in my mind with that, other than the later renderings the Greeks did, the original Greek just says there has been no evidence of a Greek crowd present. You've got Jews, Paul and evidently at least maybe some of those that are part of the body, and then Gallio and his guards. So it fills in the blank. It's just not the best Greek. So, yeah. And again, sideline issue, I'm sure it is. I find it curious, and I think sometimes we need to look more detailedly than we do at the text. Dennis and then Ray had a comment.
Didn't they have similar situations in Ephesus, where the center worship of Diana?
Right. That's in the next chapter.
The local people complaining about the taxes that they were doing. But they complain that these Christians are hurting the local economy.
Yes. But there is
All Gentiles. See, 18, it's Jews. And they are hostile, and they are dead set to get Paul. In 19, it's the Gentiles, and they stir up a mob of Greeks, of Gentiles. And they try and bring Paul to trial. They can't find him, so they grab hold of one of his brothers. So you've got two different accusing groups in the two chapters. One Jewish, Gallio says, not even worth my time. One Gentile, again, the ruler dismisses it and calls the whole mob into question. But you've got both groups being addressed, right?
I mean, if we're trying to account for
the word bema generally referred to, it would be
Equivalent, as I understand it, to our courtroom. there is some public access to it, but probably not open to the crowds and the multitudes. Probably not. But again, that's my understanding of it. I can't take you to archaeology and show you a Bema image. Doug probably could if he was here. Jake?
Is the Jews and the Greeks aren't trolling around together here. So, and if they just got dismissed, then it would suggest to me that the people that were with them were like, why didn't you say something? We were supposed to go in here and handle up on Paul, and now you're just got fired right here, which at that point, he would be a religious leader without a people.
Without people.
And now I guess so who is just gonna go right down the street to somebody that's accepting, which is just got the whole Christ passage. So that just seems very logical conclusion drawing from me.
And I'm good with that. I really am.
I'm just, again, some of these things, I realize that they're not the main issue of the text. I understand that, but I do think it's worth at least looking and recognizing some of these details. Luke put it in there. I think it's worth our attention.
That stopped me would be a believer several years later. Look at Paul, the chief persecutor of the church in the early days, and then
Now look at it.
And for that matter, I like Jake's. They gave him his pink slip by beating the fire out of him. Yeah, that might be a pretty good indicator. Maybe I need to go look somewhere else. So, yeah, I can see that. I like that turn of phrase. I really do. Let me read just a little bit further. We're going to get into another text, hopefully next week, that I really didn't want to address tonight, trying to fit all of this in one class. But let's read a few more verses. Verse 18, Paul still remained many days. It says he took leave of the brethren, sailed for Syria. Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. Very likely that's not a Nazirite vow, even though a lot of your cross-references will take you back to Numbers 7 and not cutting the hair until the vow's ended. The reason it is very likely not a Nazirite vow is because the hair was supposed to be cut off in Jerusalem and offered as a sacrifice at the temple. You weren't supposed to cut it off somewhere else and carry it home. It wasn't how it was supposed to work. So we don't know exactly what the vow is. And I don't know that we will ever be able to find out till we get home. He came to Ephesus and left them there, still using third person, so Luke hasn't rejoined him yet. He himself entered the synagogue, reasoned with the Jews, a lot like he did at Corinth. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. And I'm going to stop there. This is his first stop. The Spirit prevented him going to Ephesus when he first wanted to go, and instead he winds up in Troas and then Philippi. Now he's come by Ephesus. He either establishes a fledgling church here, converts some people, or Priscilla and Aquila, whom he leaves behind here, evidently, says he left them there at Ephesus in verse 19. Maybe they were the agents of actually getting the fledgling church started, so that by the time Paul gets back, it's already at least begun. And so he's going to go from there and build, again, a tremendous work in this important city. But evidently, the church is either established by Paul here in a very small nucleus of believers, or Priscilla and Aquila, or maybe both. Okay, verses 22 and 23, it says, when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. After he'd spent some time there, he departed, went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. So I said it wrong earlier. He's just finished his second missionary journey. He's come back again to Caesarea, Jerusalem, up to Antioch, and then he begins his third missionary journey by verse 24. and will get into this region, and he's headed toward Ephesus. And that's his goal. He finally gets to go there for a dedicated and established work. Okay. Questions, comments? I can't find any other vow that had anything to do with not cutting your hair than the Nazirite vow. But why Paul, a very careful Jew, if he took the Nazirite vow, maybe out of thanksgiving, devotion to God, seeking God's favor or blessings, if he took the Nazirite vow, why he would not fulfill it to the letter of the law, which means you go back to the temple area, and that's where the hair is removed, and that's where it's offered as a sacrifice. So this vow is one of those that I can't even find any scholarly suggestions on what it is. If it is a Nazirite vow, it sure is odd that he didn't do it according to the law. Yes, but it involved not cutting his hair, right? Pretty common. No, it'd be more like letting your hair grow out into a pony, like when you used to do that for what was that cancer thing for the hair, locks of love, right? Kind of like that. You just let it go, brother. And then at the end, with Samson's a Nazarite from birth. Well, he's got these long flowing tresses. Tresses. Anyway, long flowing hair. And the hair was to be cut off and offered as a sacrifice at the end of your vow, however long you took the vow. Samson didn't have a choice. He was supposed to be a Nazarite until death. So that's a whole messed up story. But the Nazarite vow is one of those, if we didn't have the story of Samson, it would be one of those that you'd go, why is this in Scripture? Because it doesn't seem to, it's never really shown to play a part anywhere else. Except, and potentially here, yes.
Okay. This is on. Sweet. Great. Okay. After the lesson, we will be singing 83. I remembered. I feel proud of myself. So if you want to mark your song books over there, that's where we'll be after the lesson. So last week, I brought up my time in elementary school, right? And we talked about young little Jake and his spelling words and stuff. So we're going to take you back again to my time in elementary school, my youngin' days. So back when, I was in elementary school, I think it was, I'm going to say first grade. It might have been second or third. It was one of those years. Our teacher taught us this lesson about reading directions. And now some of you, your teachers may or may not have done this to you, or if you've taught before, you may or may not have done this to your students. It's very evil, but it works. So what she did was she handed out an assignment with like 10 to 15 questions on it. And at the top, there are the directions, right? We're all familiar with the typical worksheet, right? You got your name at the top, date, directions, and then the questions that follow. And, by the time, first, second, third grade rolls around, we've done this enough that we know what the gist is, right? We just answer the questions. And so when you get to this level, you kind of stop reading the directions because most of the directions say the same exact thing. Complete the assignment, do the work. And so you really don't pay attention to the directions, right? And so what she did was at the top of the directions, if you had read it, it said, answer the last question first, right? And so if you had gone down to the last question, you would have then read, put your name on the paper, and don't answer any of the rest of the questions. Leave everything blank, and you'll get 100% on it. And so you had, the kids who didn't read the directions, they were hard at work, trying to answer all these questions, right? They hadn't read the directions, so they didn't see what the teacher had said at the bottom of the page. But then you had the other kids, right? They had read the directions. They knew what was going on. They went down to the bottom of the page. They saw that. They were like, cool, awesome, great, free like 10 to 15 minutes here. We can set down our pencils, lay our heads down, take a break, go to sleep if we need to, a little nap, read a book, whatever it might be, right? But we didn't have to actually work on the papers. And so some of the kids, eventually caught on, right? They looked around, they're like, wait, why is no one else doing this paper? And so they eventually, caught on, read the directions, went down to the page and was like, oh, that's unfortunate. And other kids, they just finished the assignment, right? They got to the bottom of the page and it was not a good day for those kids. But, whatever side you were on, whether you read the directions or not, the lesson had been taught. Directions are important. And this was kind of a lesson that I took with me throughout my entire schooling career. Call it whether she taught me this lesson or whether I became paranoid that every teacher was going to do the same exact thing to me. And it happened. It happened multiple times, even throughout college, that I would read the directions and the teacher would be like, skip this question. And if you didn't read the directions, you wouldn't have skipped that question. So it did come in handy, whether it was paranoia or what it was. But, it taught me that important lesson about reading the directions. And I think there are two main concepts, that we can take from this story and apply to our spiritual lives. And the first one, reading the direction and knowing what the directions are is extremely important, right? If we don't know what the directions are, how are we supposed to follow them, right? And so what are our directions in our Christian life? You guys can answer this for me. The Bible, right? The Word of God, the life of Christ. These are the directions that we have in our lives. And so if we don't actually read those directions, how are we supposed to know how to live a good Christian life? And, as Christians, and I think we talked about this, if you guys were in class with me last week, I kind of talked about my struggles before college with reading my Bible. But as Christians, I think we oftentimes find ourselves trying to live this good Christian life without actually reading the directions, without actually opening up our Bible and reading what's inside, unless maybe it's Sunday or Wednesday and me or Warren tells you guys to actually open up your Bibles and read, or we're nice and, put it up on the screens for you, and then you don't even have to open it, which I will not admit that I just used the screen. But we need to read the directions because it offers us the directions on how are we supposed to live this Christian life, right? And I think we see this played out really well in the temptation story, right? We're pretty familiar with that story. Jesus goes into the wilderness and he is tempted by Satan. Satan gives him 3 temptations. And how does Jesus rebuttal each and every one of them? With Scripture, right? How would Jesus have done that if he hadn't read and known Scripture, if he hadn't read and known the directions, right? And I think this leads into kind of my second point, my second concept that we can take away from this story, and that is we've got to follow the directions, right? This one's a little bit more difficult, though, right? If we read the directions but we don't actually follow them, it doesn't do us any bit of good, right? In that story I just said, if I would have read the directions but not actually followed them, right? I read that the teacher says answer the last question first, but I'm like, nah, I don't want to do that, right? And I answer all the other questions first, and then I get to the bottom of the page. I didn't get to reap the rewards of following those directions, not having to do the worksheet, right? And the same is true for our faith. If we read the directions but don't follow them, we don't actually get to reap the rewards. We don't get to reap the rewards of salvation. We don't get to reap the rewards of being with Jesus. And I think we see this a lot within the Pharisees, right? They knew the directions, frontwards and backwards, but they didn't truly know them. They didn't truly follow them, as what God intended, of what Jesus intended, right? Turn over to John chapter 8 real fast. We'll finish up with this. In John chapter 8, verse 31, he's talking to some Jews, and it says this, starting in verse 31, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Right? We focus in on verse 31, if you hold to my teachings. Well, to hold to them means you have to read them, right? You have to read the teachings, you have to read the directions, and then you've got to follow them, right? That's what Jesus is narrowing in on right here, that we have to follow the directions that God has given us within the Bible. Then we are truly disciples of Jesus, right? And then going into verse 32, then we will know the truth, and we will be set free from that truth. So the point that I wanted to make tonight is directions are important, right? I know some of us have probably tried to build, what's the joke? They try to build the little tree house. The dad goes out there. He's like, I know how to do this. I know how to build the play place without these directions. Throws them in the garbage, and then he builds the tree house completely wrong, and then it crumbles and breaks, and then he's got to go dig out the directions in the trash, right? The directions are important, and even more so for our spiritual lives, because we are like that tree house. If we don't read the directions before building up our spiritual lives, it's not going to be built right. It's going to crumble. It's going to fall. So we've got to know what those directions are. We've got to read our Bible. We've got to open it up other than Wednesdays and Sundays, and we've got to read and know what has God told us to do. So if you've been struggling, with these directions in your life and you need any help, or if you are ready to, start following those directions and accept Christ in baptism, won't you come as we stand and sing?
So good. God is so good.
First off, I wanted to tell Jake thanks for filling in last week, both Wednesday night and Sunday morning. And Jake, thank you for filling in for class. I enjoyed all of it. Um, Second, did you mention which you were of the kids on that test? Did you read these? Oh, okay. I was just wondering because I thought, okay, you didn't tell me which. Okay, Okay, I just thought I would ask. That was an important question. And third, I noticed, just in case you weren't watching, who crossed the threshold of the door first tonight? And the bad thing is, Jake was standing just 3 feet shy of the threshold, and she snuck by him. I thought that was really impressive. Okay, before I forget this one, let's start with this. We've been asked if you could stick around just for a few minutes, those that can, and we're going to tear down the tables so they can clean. Oh, so never mind. Thank y'all. Y'all did great. Thank you. Okay, scratch that one. Let's do the others. Just one thing for September is breakfast bars. Teacher sign-ups are in the foyer for the fall quarter, and I hope you'll look at that. The Cleburne Pregnancy Center Walk for Life will be Saturday, September 23rd at the Town Square in Alvarado, and there's more information on the website. Saturday, September 23rd, noon to 3 p.m. is the baby shower for Dustin and Courtney Throckmorton. They're registered at Amazon. And then there will be a ladies' luncheon baby shower for Carly Burnett Dry on Sunday, September 24th. So the fellowship hall is going to be busy. And baby Grayson's due November 3rd. Men's dove hunt October 5th through 8th. I think there's still room on that. The women's retreat will be Saturday, October 7th from 8 to 4. And Susan and Tony have information on that. Oh, there's a sheepdog meeting Tuesday, October 3rd at 7 p.m. here at the building. That's good. If you've been a part or if you'd like to be a part of that, try and be here for that. And the church camping trip is October 20 through 22nd. And then the 27th is the outdoor dinner and movie night at the Martins. And I don't know what movie we're watching this time, so we'll find out. Okay, yeah, they generally provide the main course, and okay, we'll get more details though. And 2 soups, and they were good, both of them. Don't forget to look at the sign-up sheet for Feed the Teens. It's in the foyer, and it's been changed to start at 6:15 to allow time for the sports schedule. And then the youth church event, Saturday, October 28th. Everyone is invited to see The Promise in Glen Rose. Jake's setting that up. So we got a lot of things on the schedule for the next several weeks. Okay, here's the prayer list and other announcements. Okay, Casey didn't require stents or anything, just medication, right? So that's good news. We found out today that Ginger Fields' husband passed away earlier this week. A really good guy. And then Judith's son, Will, had knee surgery yesterday. Went well and recovering. Is he doing rehab? Okay. Okay, but we'll keep that in our prayers. Kelly Arnett's home from the hospital. She had pneumonia, UTI, and kidney issues. Let's see. Benjamin Tippings and family. 1-year-old has many issues going on. Scott Knox had surgery today to move the feeding tube to his intestine, and everything went well on that. Loretta Taylor's dealing with congestive heart failure and internal bleeding. They're still trying to figure that out. Cindy's home recovering. It's just going to be a slow recovery. And Butch is having microvascular disease and very high blood pressure. So those are the prayer needs I see on the list. Anybody need somebody added to it? Okay. I'll let Stan Lawrence, if you will, dismiss us in prayer, please.
Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful that we made a good decision to come here this evening. Thank you for this lesson on our ability to help us search the scriptures. Pray that you'll bless those who are suffering in our midst, our family who has problems. Pray the Lord that you'll give them peace and understanding. Go with us now as we go home and keep us safe. We look forward to worshiping